Well, it's my privilege to introduce Patrick Johnston. And I have a brief bio of Patrick, and it's a very humble bio because I know he's got a lot more credentials than he's giving me here on a little piece of paper. But I want you to know that Patrick has had a long and varied career in the nonprofit and public sectors. At various times, he has served as the CEO of a private family foundation, the CEO of a National Association of Charities. He's been a senior policy advisor to a former Premier of Ontario and a senior policy advisor to a federal cabinet minister. Immediately following his graduation in 1980 from the University of Toronto with a Master's of Social Work, he began working with the Canadian Council on Social Development, where he undertook the research that he'll be discussing with us this afternoon. I welcome you, Patrick.
Thank you very much, Jim and Richard, and thank you very much for the invitation to participate today. A little more than 40 years ago, I was parked on a gravel road in the rural area of the Okanagan in British Columbia. I'd been there for about 5 minutes until another car drove up behind me. A woman got out and we began a discussion. That meeting on that rural road in the Okanagan was set up by Chief Wayne Christian. So you see Chief Christian's picture on the screen. This is a recent picture of him. When I met him 40 years ago, he had, at the age of, I think, 25, he had just been appointed or elected rather as chief of what was called the Spalumcheen Band at the time. It's now the Splatson First Nation. I had met Chief Christian about 6 months prior to that at a meeting in Regina of the Canadian Indian Lawyers Association. And that meeting had been established in particular because of the concern of the members of that organization, highly disproportionate number of Indigenous kids who were in the care of child welfare authorities. When I use the term child welfare, I'm talking about what we would know of as foster care, group homes, adoption. I had first met Chief Christian in Regina about 6 months before that September 1981 meeting. And he had invited me to join him on the Spalumcheen Band to come and visit him at his home and also to visit their school. He had, in our discussions, he realized that I was doing some research, trying to gain a better understanding of why there were so many children, Indigenous children, in the care of child welfare authorities. And in my meeting with him, he invited me to dinner at his home. And in our discussion, I'd mentioned to them that I was really interested in trying to identify and interview a social worker who had been involved, particularly in the system, the child welfare system, in the 60s, who had been involved in actually removing Indigenous children from the reserves. I was having enormous difficulty finding someone who would be willing to speak to me. And he said, I think I know somebody. And he made a few phone calls. And sure enough, he had identified somebody who was willing to speak to me. But she would only do that on the condition that I would never know her name. She was a longtime social worker who worked with the BC Human Resources Department, but she was so nervous about speaking to me that she didn't want to reveal her name. And she was the one that insisted we meet on that gravel road because she didn't want to see anybody or didn't want to have anybody who would see us talking. She was that paranoid to some extent about the conversation that we then had. In my discussions with her, and again, I never knew her name. To this day, I don't know her name. But she talked to me about what it was like to be a social worker working in that area. And she told me that in the 60s, as a matter of course, social workers were removing, and she used the term scooping, Indigenous kids from First Nations communities as a matter of course. Chief Christian, again, who you see on the screen, got involved in this because the Spalumcheen Band in the 60s and 70s had a population of only 350, but 100 of their children during that period were removed by the child welfare authorities. In the discussion with this woman as well, She, at one point, burst into tears as we were talking. She said, you have to understand that we honestly believed at the time that by removing Indigenous children from their families and the reserves, we were acting in the best interests of the children. She said now, again in tears, she said, I realize now what a terrible mistake that was, that there has been so much damage caused, but you have to understand that we were really trying to act in the best interests of those children. She used the term to describe that as the 60s scoop. I had never heard that term before I met that woman. I didn't hear it after that. I had never seen the term in print, but it was such a strong evocative term that I used it as a chapter in what eventually became a book I wrote. And I referred to the 60s scoop throughout that presentation, throughout the book. And I think that's the origin then of the term, the 60s scoop. That book was published jointly by the Canadian Council on Social Development, with whom I worked, for whom I worked at the time. The research was undertaken over a 2-year period. The Canadian Council on Social Development, which was a social policy analysis and research organization, highly respected in its state, founded in 1920, actually, by Charlotte Wetton, and founded as a Canadian Council on Child Welfare. It was a publisher in its own right, but in this instance, it also sought and secured an agreement with James Lorimer, a commercial publisher, because there was a sense that the topic would be of broader interest and there might actually be a bit of a commercial market for it. As it turned out, I believe it sold several thousand copies. It was, for a period of time, it was a requirement on many curriculum in schools of social work, particularly in Western Canada. Before I began to do that research, I had consulted extensively with a number of Indigenous organizations. Being a white man, working with a very mainstream non-Indigenous organization, I wanted to ensure that before we even began the work, that I would have the support of Indigenous individuals and organizations. And I want to, in particular, identify the Native Women's Association of Canada, who were very, very supportive and very helpful with me throughout that 2-year period of research, and without whom I really probably could not have done that work. I would not have had access and received the invitations to visit First Nations communities across the country that I did. I was also assisted and formed by an advisory group that included a majority of Indigenous individuals, as well as others who had some experience and expertise in the child welfare field. I was able to benefit from some previous work done by a former colleague of mine at the Council on Social Development, who wrote a book in 1980 entitled Foster Care and Adoption in Canada. And he had a chapter in that book that was, for the first time, presented some statistics on the number of Indigenous children in the care of child welfare authorities. And I'll come back and talk a bit more about that in a few minutes. Another important input or influence on my decision and the work that I did was a conference on social development that was held every couple of years. That year, 1980, it happened to be held in St. John's, Newfoundland. There was a workshop of child welfare authorities or officials from across the country, every one of whom, I think there were 5 on that panel, every one of whom said in the 1980s, the most important and significant challenge we face is the highly disproportionate number of Indigenous children who are in the care of the child welfare authorities across the country. I undertook extensive consultations as a part of my research. I traveled across the country several times, particularly in Northern Ontario and the 4 Western provinces. In addition, I sent a very, very detailed questionnaire to all of the provinces and to the 2 territories at the time, and Nunavut didn't exist, to inform the work that I was doing that eventually resulted in a book. I have to say that I did not set out to write a book. I was writing a number of individual articles, but at one point I realized I had access to information that enabled me to sort of provide a national picture, because that was what was missing at the time, because child welfare is exclusively a provincial jurisdiction. It was very difficult to get a national picture in terms of what was happening with respect to Indigenous kids in the child welfare systems across the country. I also, I think I mentioned before that Philip Hepworth, a colleague of mine, had already done some work that estimated that more than 15,000 Indian and Métis children who were in the care of child welfare authorities in 1977. There are some people, and you will see sometimes some estimates that number was actually closer to 20,000. I think it's fair to say, and my sense is that these are a real, this is an underestimate. The data collection systems in those days were very, very archaic. This was a pre-computer era. I think those numbers, if anything, are probably an underestimate. But I will present just a few statistics to give you a bit of a picture. The other thing that Hepworth, in the work that he did that chapter, that he discovered is that once Indigenous kids came into the care of child welfare authorities, they were far less likely than non-Indigenous kids to be returned to their parents, and they were far more likely to be placed in non-Indigenous foster families. Here are some stats. I'm not going to bore you with a lot of this. The stats in the book is chock full of that. They're all quite dated now, of course, but here are some statistics from 3 provinces. And these figures come directly from my book, and I received these directly from provincial child welfare authorities. But in 1980 in Ontario, the number of Indigenous kids relative to the total kids population 0 to 19 was only about 1.1%. But the proportion of kids in care who were Indigenous was 8%. So much, much higher proportion than the population as a whole. The same was true in, and I just used 2 examples of provinces here in British Columbia, although Indigenous children only represent 3.5% of all kids in BC under the age of 19. They represented 38%, almost 39% of all kids in care. And in Saskatchewan, the numbers were even higher. In Saskatchewan, Indigenous kids were a little more than 8% of all kids under the age of 19, but they represented more than 2/3 of all children in care of child welfare authorities. The Department of Indian Affairs and Northern Development, as was known at the time, estimated that there were 11,123 status Indian children adopted between the years of 1960 and 1990. And in terms of where those children ended up, who were adopted, the majority were adopted by non-Indigenous families. So the statistics that were provided to me at that time by the Ontario government, you'll see them in front of you, but they increased from 1977 to 1981. By 1981, they represented almost 3/4 or almost 3/4 of Indigenous children who were placed for adoption were placed with non-Indigenous families. And the reason that becomes important will become, I think, a little clearer later. Some of the other facts that emerged in terms of adoption of Indigenous children is that those Indigenous kids who were adopted by non-Indigenous families had a relatively high failure rate. There weren't a lot of studies or research done at the time, but Christopher Bagley, who was a professor, I think, at the University of Calgary, undertook a study in 1993 that found that by the age of 17, almost half of the adoptions of Indigenous children who had been placed with non-Indigenous families had failed. I've seen some other figures that suggest by the age of 19 that failure rate, it was even higher, somewhere in the order of 70%. There was a study done of 100 adoptees in Pennsylvania, and these are adoptees who were Indigenous children from Manitoba who had been placed for adoption with families in Pennsylvania. And that study found that the success rate for those Indigenous kids from Manitoba were much, much worse compared to kids in similar situations who were Black, Vietnamese, or who were Korean. Now, the question is, why was this the case? Why was there such a highly disproportionate number of Indigenous kids in the care of the child welfare authorities in the 60s and 70s? And I should point out as well that this happened very, very quickly, that increase happened very, very quickly, essentially primarily in the 60s. It began at the beginning of the 60s, at the end of the 50s. The rate of kids being in care, Indigenous kids being in care, was really quite low. But it increased exponentially over that 10-year period. And here are some of the reasons. And again, I won't go into a whole lot of detail on all of these. Some of these, I may be able to, if you have questions about them, I'm happy to do that in the question and answer period. But a large part of the problem here was disputes between the federal and provincial governments, and a lot of buck passing. The federal government would say, we have jurisdictional constitutional responsibility for First Nations and other Indigenous peoples, but we do not have responsibility for the delivery of child welfare. The provinces would say, we have responsibility under the Constitution for the provision of child welfare services, but we do not have any responsibility for service delivered, particularly on reserves. And it was that kind of buck passing back and forth and finger pointing that was a large part of the reason that we ended up in the situation that we did in terms of those Indigenous kids coming into care. It's also been known and understood for quite some time by people with expertise in child welfare that there are a number of socioeconomic factors that contribute to children being taken into care by child welfare authorities, whether Indigenous or not Indigenous. To the extent that families experience poverty, poor housing, inadequate health care, they are far more likely then to engage and encounter the child welfare system than other families. That situation, of course, was in the 60s and 70s, and even today, exacerbated in particular in a number of Indigenous communities that experienced all of those conditions: poverty, poor housing, inadequate health. So to some extent, kind of what was happening to Indigenous children was happening to others, but non-Indigenous kids as well, because of those factors. I think it's fair to say, and the social worker the child welfare worker that I interviewed on that dusty road in British Columbia would be an example of this. The child welfare workers had a minimal understanding of or respect for Indigenous culture, customs, and practices. There was a sense, I think, on the part of many social workers at that time who were part of a dominant culture, that the values, the traditions of the dominant society are really what counted, and that any variation or deviance from that in the Indigenous communities was not only not understood, it really was not. Even if it was understood, it simply wasn't given any respect at all. Another factor is that there was actually, in some provinces, in Saskatchewan in particular, there was a very, very aggressive marketing campaign by provincial authorities of Indigenous kids that they were hoping would be adopted. And I'm just going to now give you an example or two screenshots here of the kinds of marketing that were done at the time, encouraging families to adopt Indigenous kids. Here are kind of two side-by-side ads that would appear regularly in newspapers in Saskatchewan. And again, this is, remember now I'm talking about kind of the 60s and 70s. The one on the right-hand side, I think in particular, if you can read the headline, it says, "Out of nowhere into here." Now, the inference is pretty clear that these are children who live nowhere. I mean, the term itself, I would think, would be offensive to many Indigenous people, that the children were living in nowhere. Here's another ad, typical ad, that appeared in many publications, particularly in Saskatchewan at the time. I blotted out the faces and the names of these children, but if you read that headline, brown-skinned babies too need loving care. This, again, I think was typical of the aggressive marketing of Indigenous children, looking for, or the authorities were looking for adoptive families that took place in the 60s. There's absolutely no question that part of the reason as well for the large number of children, particularly in the 60s, kind of Indigenous kids who ended up in the child welfare situation, the child welfare system, is a legacy of residential schools. I don't think a coincidence that as the number of residential schools continued to decline beginning in the 50s and 60s, the number of children who entered into the child welfare system increased almost in lockstep. And I've taken a quote here from the Truth and Reconciliation Commission chaired by Murray Sinclair in 2015 that said, what has come to be called the 60s Scoop was in some measure simply a transferring of children from one form of institution, the residential school, to another, the child welfare agency. Other factors that contributed to that rate, the disproportionate rate of Indigenous kids being taken into the care of child welfare authorities. It is clear that there were assimilation policies that were attempted over the course of many, many decades that were based on the assumption that the dominant culture was clearly superior to and the Indigenous culture was inferior. There was also, frankly, it was the result of long-standing, deep-seated prejudice and racism. There's absolutely no question about that. And the next two slides are going to give you an example of the assimilationist sort of policies and perspectives that were in place at the time, and also examples of clear prejudice and racism. The first is a direct quote from Duncan Campbell Scott, who was the Deputy Minister of Indian Affairs in 1920. And he was quoted to say that, I want to get rid of the Indian problem. Our object is to continue until there's not a single Indian in Canada that has not been absorbed into the body politics, and there is no Indian question and no Indian department. Now, I suspect some of you will say, well, that was more than 100 years ago. But keep in mind that only 50 years after that, in 1969, the government at the time, Pierre Trudeau's government, I believe, brought in a white paper that proposed to end status for Indigenous peoples, to rescind the Indian Act, and to abolish the Department of Indian Affairs. There was such an uproar at the time, if any of you kind of remember that period, there was such an uproar at the time, particularly on the part of Indigenous organizations, that the federal government backed away very, very quickly, and that white paper never saw the light of day. The next slide is a quote from Bishop Grandin, who had been very involved in the development of residential schools, and this is what he said. We instill in them, Indigenous kids, a pronounced distaste for native life, so that they will be humiliated when reminded of their origin. When they graduate from our institutions, the children have lost everything native except their blood. Now, this was a blunt assessment perspective, but Bishop Grandin, unfortunately, was not alone at all in sharing that perspective. And that sense of an intentional desire to humiliate Indigenous peoples was infused not only in the residential school system, but to some extent, as a legacy of residential schools, was infused in the early stages, at least, on the part of some people in the child welfare system. I want to now spend a bit of time talking about the impact. The Truth and Reconciliation Commission, and it's instructive, I think the first 5 recommendations of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission all related to changes that were required and necessary in the child welfare system, but they concluded that Indigenous kids were placed in a position of triple jeopardy. Not only were they removed from their families, they were removed from their communities, and they were removed from their culture. This is a picture taken in 1981 of Chief Wayne Christian, whose picture you first saw at the beginning of the presentation. Chief Christian himself had been part of the 60s Scoop. He was removed, I believe, at the age of 12. He was the eldest of his siblings. All of his siblings were removed by the child welfare authorities. Wayne went back to his family, his mother, at the age of 17. But his younger siblings had been out, away from the communities for a much longer period of time. They were much older when they returned. One of his brothers in particular, who had been removed at a very early age, but eventually came back to the family and back to Spelumcheen, was clearly struggling. And Wayne talked at that conference in Regina of the Indian Lawyers Association about the pain that his younger brother was going through in being caught between two cultures, because he was so young when he was removed from his family and the Spelumcheen band that he really had very little memory of what it was like to live in that community. And yet, as he grew older, he realized he also didn't belong in a white community. I mean, he looked physically different. The experiences kind of that he remembered as a child kind of were very, very, very different. He ended up, though, going home, but he was not able to fit in. And Wayne talked about seeing the pain in his brother trying to reconcile these two competing cultures and not being sure of who he really was. Enormous sort of identity challenges. He talked also about one night, his mother had a premonition that something terrible had happened. Wayne checked, and I gather his brother was missing, wasn't in his bedroom. Wayne went out to look for him and found him out in the bush somewhere. He had committed suicide it was a self-inflicted gunshot wound. That is partly what prompted Chief Christian's interest in this topic. He took it very personally, but he was a very, very smart, very politically astute. He led a caravan of 1,000 marchers, mostly Indigenous, and marched on the home of the BC minister responsible for child welfare, Grace McCarthy, I think her name was at the time, and managed to secure from her and the federal government an agreement to allow the Spelumcheen band to take responsibility for its own children. The child welfare system was one of the very first and very, very early examples of a First Nation community actually taking the responsibility for child welfare for their own children. I want to now quote from 3 reports in particular that I think really summarize far more effectively than I could what the impact of the 60s Scoop was. This is from a Manitoba Justice, Edward Kimmelman, in 1985, who had been asked by the provincial government of Manitoba if he would look at the problems in the Manitoba child welfare system in terms of the disproportionate number of Indigenous kids who were in care. Manitoba was also, I think, feeling the pressure of a lot of criticisms from Indigenous organizations at the time about the fact that they were the last province that was still placing Indigenous children outside of the province and outside the country. There were many Indigenous children who were placed in the southern states, Louisiana, Mississippi, Alabama, for example. But Justice Kindle concluded in his report he issued in 1985, he said this: "The abysmal lack of sensitivity to children and families was revealed. Families approached agencies for help and found that what was described as being in the child's best interest resulted in their families being torn asunder and siblings separated. Social workers grappled with cultural patterns far different than their own, with no preparation and no opportunity to gain understanding." The report of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission that I've mentioned earlier said this: "The effects of residential schools and the 60s Scoop on Aboriginal people and their families resulted in generational and historical trauma that negatively affected parenting skills, social values, economic conditions, and future success. This trauma has caused overwhelming rates of suicide, homicide, depression, substance abuse, alcoholism, child abuse, domestic violence, struggles of self-identity, and other social problems. And finally, a report, well, actually, it was a judgment from an Ontario Superior Court Justice, Edward Bellobaba, in 2017, as a result of a class action suit. I'll talk briefly about it in a minute or two. He said, the 60s scoop happened and great harm was done. The uncontroverted evidence of the plaintiff's expert is that the loss of their Aboriginal identity left the children fundamentally disoriented with a reduced ability to lead healthy and fulfilling lives. The loss of Aboriginal identity resulted in psychiatric disorders, substance abuse, unemployment, violence, and numerous suicides. Those three reports, I think, summarize better than I could the impact that the disproportionate number of children in the care of child welfare, Indigenous kids in the care of child welfare authorities had, not only on those children, but on families and on culture. I want to now actually bring this even closer to home, or closer to sort of reality in terms of talking about the examples of two children in particular. This is hard to read, so I'm just going to read the first paragraph. These are both in the public domain, so I felt comfortable sharing these. This first one was in Maclean's magazine in 1984 in an article entitled Bringing the Children Home, and it reads, in 1969, when Cameron Antoine, a Sioux from Brandon, Manitoba, was 5, he watched a white man beat his father to death with a rock. Antoine's mother was unable to deal with the psychological trauma of the death, and the Children's Aid Society placed Cameron and his 2 brothers and 3 sisters in foster homes. In 1975, Joseph Richard Curley, a plant manager at a stone mason company from Wichita, Kansas, adopted Cameron. Over the next 3 years, Curley sexually abused Cameron. Just into his teens, Cameron became an alcoholic. Last Labor Day weekend, he became drunk and killed his adoptive father. And last week, after Cameron pleaded guilty to second-degree murder, Judge Robert Heisel of the Sedgwick District Court in Wichita sentenced him to 15 years to life. He will be eligible for parole in 10 years. Said Cameron's lawyer, Monty Vines, the whole case is a tragedy. And one more story. Again, this was taken from Maclean's 1999. I'll just read the first paragraph. Carla Williams was 4 when the authorities knocked on the door and took the terrified Manitoba native youngster away from her parents forever. It was 1968, and Williams was thrust into a white society where nobody spoke her native tongue. 3 years of cultural confusion later, she was adopted by a family that then moved to Holland. There, the young girl was permitted no contact with her grieving parents back in Canada. Subjected to emotional and sexual abuse, she had 3 babies by the age of 16. 2 of them, she says, by her adoptive father, and 1 was given up for adoption. Finally, after her descent into alcohol, drugs, and prostitution, the Dutch government received an official request from Canada to have her returned. Williams left Amsterdam in 1989 at the age of 25, shouting, "I'm coming home." She arrived back in Canada too late to meet the parents she had barely known. After the removal of 3 of their children, her native mother and father committed suicide. Now, those 2 examples are not typical of every Indigenous child who was placed for adoption, but sadly, they're not atypical either. The number of stories similar to that I heard and have during research I was doing and subsequently are painful actually to hear, but they're very much part of the reality and the outcome of what many social workers at the time thought were in the best interests of Indigenous kids. I'm going to now wrap up in the next few minutes, but I want to talk a bit about what has happened since the 60s and 70s. It was the case that after my book was published, there was a flurry of activity by a number of the provincial governments in particular who were trying to now understand what they needed to be doing, and federal government as well, to address the highly disproportionate number and the inappropriate services that were being delivered to Indigenous families across the country. There were a number of changes. Manitoba instituted a moratorium forbidding the adoption of Indigenous kids outside of Manitoba it was, as I say, the last province to do that. There were a number of steps like that. But after a couple of years, the issue almost completely sort of left the public policy radar screen. I was met I think he was from the province of Alberta, child welfare official, probably about 8 or 9 years after I wrote the book, asking if, because the statistics at that point were quite outdated, asking if I would do it again and do an update. And I said at the time, no, I don't think it's appropriate for me. I'm a white man, frankly, I did that first book, but I really do think that it is now up to Indigenous people themselves to take this issue forward. I think it's fair to say that for a number of years, not much was happening. There were still people like Chief Wayne Christian, for example, who are still trying to continue to inform people about the incredible damage that has been done to Indigenous kids and families and communities. But he was kind of one of a few voices, and there were voices in the wilderness. But what started to happen is that a number of those children who had been removed from their families and communities, Indigenous kids, they became adults and they became very, very active. And I think a large part of what we have seen recently in the last 15 years in particular have been driven by Indigenous people themselves, many of whom were in those situations where they had been removed from their family and they suffered the impacts. And I want to just also make clear here that not every Indigenous child who was placed in the non-Indigenous family had a negative experience. It was far, far more common than I think we realized, but there were a number of individuals who actually went into healthy, happy, non-Indigenous foster adoptive families and had quite a healthy upbringing. But even people like Dr. Raven Sinclair at the University of Saskatchewan, who herself describes herself as a survivor of the Sixties Scoop and had a very good experience with her adoptive family. So the one thing that they were never really able to do for her, though, is to help connect her to her culture. It was impossible for them. They weren't Indigenous. And that is the one thing, in spite of the fact that she had a very, very positive experience in terms of her situation. But that was the one thing even then that she really felt lacking in her life, and that was a real challenge for her. Unfortunately, though, Dr. Sinclair's relatively positive experience was more the exception to the rule. It was also the result, I think some of the more recent, more positive developments have been the result of very effective advocacy by Indigenous organizations like the First Nations Child and Family Caring Society, headed up by Dr. Cindy Blackstock. Some of you may know her. A number of organizations across the country, provincial, and there's a national association of the survivors of the 60s Scoop who have come together to advocate for change, for a sort of a reconciliation and understanding, some restitution as well. I think people like this you see on the screen have been a large part of increased understanding and awareness and recognition of the damage that was done by to Indigenous kids, families, and cultures in the 60s and 70s. There was a launch by Dr. Blackstock at the First Nations Child and Family Services in 2007, the Human Rights Commission, the Canadian Human Rights Commission, about the discriminatory underfunding of child welfare in First Nations communities relative to non-Indigenous communities. And there was eventually a ruling by the commission that agreed that there was outright complete discrimination. The federal government for a long time was really trying to duck and avoid its responsibility. The commission had to issue several requirements and warnings to them about the federal government's failure to respond. They eventually did, but it took several years. There was a class action suit. This is a class action suit. I had mentioned Justice Edward Delababa before, who heard that suit. It was filed in 2019. In 2017, it resulted in an award to the Sixties Scoop victims by the federal government, who settled out of court. And there was an $800 million settlement. Some of that money, I think about up to $25,000 per person, would be provided to survivors of the Sixties Scoop. Plus, there was money for a foundation that would help provide healing for some of the families and the people who were affected by the Sixties Scoop. There were official apologies in 3 provincial legislatures, Manitoba, Saskatchewan, and Alberta. The premiers of each of those provinces issued formal and official apologies to Sixties Scoop survivors for what had happened in their jurisdictions during the period of the Sixties Scoop. Jordan's principle, I mentioned before about one of the problems being the federal provincial jurisdictional disputes being a large part of the problem here. Jordan River Anderson was a young Indigenous First Nations child born with multiple health complex and which resulted in him having to be in hospital for the first 3 years of his life. At the point at which his doctor said he could go home, it then became an issue because his family needed extensive home supports. The federal and provincial governments spent 2 years arguing over who was responsible for paying for those home supports. In the meantime, Jordan continued to stay in the hospital when he didn't need the care of the hospital. And he died at the age of 5 after spending 2 years in hospital beyond the time he needed to be there, without ever having lived at home with his family. As a result of that, Jordan's principle now requires that services be provided to Indigenous children who need them, and the issue of who is responsible for paying will be settled after the fact. But there is now a formal requirement called the Jordan's principle, so that there would never be another Jordan River Anderson. And finally, as I mentioned in response, I think before, I had mentioned that there was a federal government that finally, responding to the complaints of the Canadian Human Rights Commission, that proposed Bill C-92 and is ultimately passed and is now in effect, an act respecting First Nations, Inuit, and Métis children, youth, and families, that has transferred now, beginning the process of transferring responsibility for child welfare services to First Nations and other Indigenous communities in a formal process. That act has only been in effect now for, I think, 2 years, but it's a sign, I think, of an understanding finally that ultimately it is really First Nations and other Indigenous peoples who are best responsible for and able to provide the kind of culturally appropriate care that's required by children and families who are in need. So with that, I'm going to thank everybody for attending. Happy to answer any questions that there might be. I've also left my an email address here. My book is long since out of print, but I had it digitized a few years ago. If anybody's interested, I'm happy just to provide a copy. There's no charge. Now, the statistics, as I say, are very, very dated. Some of the narrative is still applied. I should, and just finally in closing, I should say that it is still the case that there are a large number of Indigenous kids in the care of child welfare authorities across the country. The difference being now, though, there are many more providers of child welfare who are Indigenous, so are better connected and understanding, better connected to families, better connected to communities, and better understanding of the kind of cultural services that are appropriate for Indigenous kids and families. So with that, I'll close. Happy to respond to any questions there may be.
If you do have any questions, the best way to pose your questions would be to put them in the chat, and we could read them from there. This chat function in Zoom.
And if people, Jerry, if people after the fact also want to just send me any questions they may have, they may not want to sort of pose them now, I'm happy again. The email address was there, so happy to respond to any questions that people may have after the fact.
Thank you. And I guess you stopped screen sharing, which had your
Yeah,
your email
probably go
address.
back to that kind of.
Yeah, if you could leave that up, I think that would be
Sure.
helpful.
Yeah, let me do that. Probably take me back to the very first. Let me see. I'll just. There it is.
Okay.
I think there may have been a question in the chat, but I'm not sure I can. Let me just see now.
So
Yeah, so the question was,
ahead.
how did the term 60 scoop evolve? As I think I mentioned, that term, the 60 scoop, as I understand it, was a term that group of social workers that the woman that I had met and interviewed on that dusty road in the Okanagan used amongst themselves to describe what had happened during the time they were removing those children from care in the 60s. They sort of themselves colloquially referred to it as the 60 scoop. I had never, during the 2 years of research, I had never heard that term before. I met that woman. I had never heard it after that. But as I said, to me, it was just such an evocative term that I used it throughout my book. And I think that's why, and to the best of my knowledge, the term the 60 scoop had never, ever appeared in print before. So I think it's an example of a term that really was very, very local, that was used by those longtime workers that then became sort of expanded. And I think partly because of the fact that I used it in my book, and it just now started to, it's become, I think, if you Google just the term 60 scoop, it's really quite phenomenal to see. So that was kind of the origin. As I say, I would never have guessed at the time that I used it. It just struck me as such an evocative term. But that was the origin. It was really those social workers, those child welfare workers, colloquially in that local area who would use the term.
Oh, yeah. Oh, Patrick, Armin Labarge here. I enjoyed your talk, and I look forward to reading your book. I've done research in regards to Indigenous issues. I'm the former chair of Trent University. That's why it was on my screensaver. But some of my research has indicated that First Nations individuals that were estranged from and not raised within their own community, who attended in what they called Indigenous awareness training, were reawakened, or as some of them called it, reborn. And a couple of the Haudenosaunee participants that I spoke to talked about actually receiving teaching from Anishinaabe elders and really being reinvigorated. I don't know if that came up in any of your research or not, Patrick.
It didn't at the time I was doing the research, because remember, I was gathering data in 1980 based on statistics the provinces were giving me from the 70s about people who were still kids and youth at that time. But certainly subsequent to that, because this is an issue that I've continued to keep engaged with and I care about, and I have kept in touch with a number and hear from a number of Indigenous adults now in their 50s who had gone through kind of the child welfare system, often being adopted by non-Indigenous families, who report exactly the same situation experience that you're describing, that they had a reawakening of their, and perhaps even for some a kind of a revelation, that they had a culture, a history, a lineage that they were only vaguely aware of. And the more they understood that, the more they really wanted to understand where they came from. I think it's probably true for many people that as you get older, you do become more sort of interested in your origins and who are you, where are you from? That was certainly the case with a number of, and I've noticed, as I say, in particular, interestingly enough, on the part of Indigenous kids who were adopted by non-Indigenous families, and may have had, like Dr. Sinclair, may have had a relatively good experience with the foster family, but were missing something. And the more they understood that they were missing that connection to their culture, the more they wanted to better understand, and they sought help from individual elders, organizations. So that is not an uncommon experience at all, Armand.
Patrick, and just again through you, Richard, Jim, some of my participants talked about resisting that training initially. They had to go to it as a result of an employment responsibility, but within one day, the eye rolling and the crossed arms and the shoulder shrugging stopped. And these were non-Indigenous and Indigenous participants. And they literally were looking forward to and applying to go on more of that training. And it wasn't until they were actually forced to go on it that they appreciated the value of it. And especially the Indigenous participants spoke about the incredible impact it had on them. And some of them had relatives that were in residential schools, and they came to a better understanding of how that had a longitudinal or longer term effect on their families going forward.
Right. Yeah. No, I have to say too, you kind of remind me, Armand, that one of the things that I don't think many people really understood at the time I was doing the research kind of in the 80s, was the extent to which what was happening in the child welfare system there was really a legacy of residential schools. I mean, there was certainly nowhere near the public awareness of residential schools then that there is today. I mean, most non-Indigenous people had never heard of, didn't know anything about the fact that there were residential schools. So that's kind of also, I think, a sort of an awareness that has happened over the last several decades, in particular about that, the interrelationship. And I think in particularly because we now have better understanding of intergenerational trauma. If you think about it, it makes sense. If during the residential school system, if you're removing young children from the natural sort of family situation where they understand and learn and are socialized in terms of how, as a parent kind of deals with you, how you would then sort of deal with your children. If you lose that, it becomes much more difficult then to understand, to naturally sort of be able to parent when you're yourself a parent. So it's if you talk to, in my experience has been, if you talk to a lot of people who themselves are involved in the 60s Scoop and removed from their families, their parents were in residential schools. So it's an example, again, of that sort of intergenerational trauma, again, that we really didn't have any understanding of 40, 50, 60 years ago, or at least nowhere near the extent that we do now.
Patrick, you've detailed the scope and the breadth of the 60s Scoop for us. You've provided us with a sensitive, a thoughtful, and insightful understanding of the issues, the complications, and the realities of the period for our Indigenous brothers and sisters. Thank you for sharing this difficult story. May we learn well the lessons from this tragic time. The effects, I'm sure, the ripple effects of this will be with us for a long time. And I think we need to be conscious of that and make sure that we do our own part in helping correct this unfortunate situation. I really appreciate having you with us today, and I wish you well in your future endeavors, whatever they should be. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jim, and thanks everybody for the invitation and for participating in this discussion. Thanks very much.